There is exactly one confirmed case of a pirate burying treasure in the entire recorded history of the Golden Age of Piracy. One. Out of hundreds of captains, thousands of voyages, and decades of robbery on the open sea, there is a single documented instance of a pirate digging a hole, dropping his gold into the ground, and walking away. And the man who did it? He told someone exactly where it was. It didn't save his life. Everything else you think you know about buried pirate gold, the hand-drawn map, the X marking the spot, the chest crammed full of doubloons hidden beneath a sun-bleached palm tree on some remote island, that was invented by a Scottish novelist who was dying of tuberculosis in 1883. He never set foot on a pirate ship. He never crossed the Atlantic. He wrote the bulk of his story in a damp house in the Scottish Highlands, trying to keep himself and his young stepson entertained. And somehow, what he imagined became more real to most people than actual history ever could. Welcome to Dead Man's Shore. I'm Jack, and today we're going to pull apart one of the most powerful myths in all of pirate lore. We're going to look at the real economics of piracy, at why burying your gold was almost never something a pirate would actually do, at the one extraordinary man who did bury his treasure and what happened to him afterward, and at the chain of events that turned his desperate last gamble into a global obsession still pulling people onto beaches with metal detectors to this day. If you're new here, welcome aboard. Hit that subscribe button because every episode on this channel digs into the real history behind the pirate stories you think you already know. And trust me, the truth is always stranger and messier and more fascinating than the legend. Now, the buried treasure myth. Let's talk about why it exists, why it feels so real, and why almost every single element of it is a complete invention. The image is very specific, and that specificity is part of why it works so well. You can close your eyes right now and picture it without any effort at all. The chest is wooden, iron-banded, half sunken into white sand. There are palm trees. There's a piece of yellowed paper with a dotted root drawn on it, and a bold X at the end. Somewhere nearby, probably, there's a one-legged man with a parrot on his shoulder, watching with narrowed eyes. The whole scene has weight. It has texture. It feels like something that was handed down through generations, like a piece of genuine folk memory from the age of sail. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Every single element of that image, the map, the X, the tropical island, the chest, the one-legged pirate, the parrot, all of it traces back to one source. One novel published in late 1883 called Treasure Island, written by Robert Louis Stevenson. That book didn't build on an existing myth. It didn't take scattered folklore and organize it into a tidy narrative. It invented the trope from nothing. Before Treasure Island, the idea of a pirate burying a chest of gold and leaving a map simply did not exist in the popular imagination. You won't find it in newspaper accounts from the 1700s. You won't find it in the trial records of captured pirates. You won't find it in the journals of colonial governors or the logs of naval captains who chased pirates across the Caribbean. The buried treasure map was not a piece of pirate history. It was a piece of pirate fiction, written by a sick man in Scotland who needed something exciting to do on a rainy afternoon. And yet, within a generation of that book's publication, the myth had become so entrenched that people assumed it had always been true. Treasure Island didn't feel like an invention. It felt like a confirmation of something people already half believed. That's how powerful a well-told story can be. It doesn't just entertain you, it rewrites your understanding of the past. So if pirates didn't bury their gold, and with one single exception, they absolutely didn't, what did they actually do with it? because they were certainly stealing plenty of it. The Golden Age of Piracy, roughly from 1680 to 1730, saw pirates seize enormous amounts of wealth from merchant ships crossing the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. Gold, silver, jewels, trade goods, spices, cloth, weapons. The plunder was real, it was substantial, and it moved fast. Where did it all go? The answer is both simple and, once you think it through, completely obvious. Pirates spent their money. They spent it fast, they spent it enthusiastically, and in most cases, they spent it until it was completely gone. And then they went back out to sea to steal some more. That's it. That's the whole economic model. There was no savings plan. There was no retirement strategy. There was no vault under the floorboards of a seaside cottage where a retired pirate was quietly sitting on a fortune. The men who went on the account, the old term for turning pirate, lived in an almost permanent cycle of theft and consumption, and most of them died before they ever had a chance to think about what came next. Think about what a pirate crew actually needed to operate. A ship, for a start. Ships of the era required constant, expensive maintenance. Ropes rotted, sails tore, planking warped and leaked, cannons cracked, rigging failed. Every time a pirate crew put into a friendly port or a remote careening beach to repair their vessel, they were spending money. Gunpowder was another enormous expense. It wasn't cheap, and a crew that was boarding merchant ships and firing warning shots and occasionally fighting off naval vessels burned through it at a serious rate. Food and fresh water had to be bought or traded for regularly. Crews that went too long without supplies got scurvy, got sick, got desperate, and turned on their captains. And then there were the human costs. Medical care in the early 1700s was limited by modern standards, but it wasn't free. Surgeons, and most pirate ships had one because healthy crew members were a practical necessity, had to be paid and kept supplied. Treatment for injuries and the management of diseases like malaria and typhoid all required materials that cost money to acquire. Some pirate articles, the written codes that governed how a crew operated, even specified fixed compensation amounts for injuries sustained during a raid. Lose your right arm? Here's a set payment from the shared fund. Lose an eye? Here's your share. This was organized. This was institutional. It was not the behavior of men who were salting away fortunes in the ground. Then there were the bribes. Colonial governance in the Caribbean during the Golden Age of Piracy was shot through with corruption. Governors, customs officials, port officers, local merchants. Many of them were perfectly willing to look the other way when a pirate ship sailed into harbor, provided the price was right. Port Royal in Jamaica, before the earthquake of 1692, was famously open to pirates. Nassau in the Bahamas was so thoroughly dominated by pirate crews in the early 1700s that it was essentially a pirate republic for a time. Keeping those arrangements running cost money, constantly. A pirate captain who wanted to walk freely through a port town, sell his plunder, resupply his ship, and recruit new crew members had to spread gold around liberally. That gold was gone. It didn't come back. And beyond all of those practical expenses, there was everything else. There was rum. Enormous, almost incomprehensible amounts of rum. There were gambling games that could strip a man of his entire share of a prize in a single night. There were the taverns and the lodging houses, and every form of entertainment that a sailor starved of comfort for months at sea would predictably and inevitably spend money on the moment he had any. Historical accounts from ports like Nassau, Tortuga, and various Caribbean harbors all describe the same basic pattern. A pirate crew would arrive flush from a successful raid, with pockets full of coin, and within days or weeks, most of that money would be gone. Back into the local economy, into the pockets of merchants and tavern keepers and everyone else who had something to sell to men with more cash than patience. Now, you might ask, what about a really clever pirate? What about someone careful, someone who held back a share of his plunder instead of spending it all? Wouldn't that man have buried some of it somewhere safe? Maybe, in theory. But here's the problem. The average working life of a pirate during the Golden Age was brutally short. Historians who've looked carefully at the records estimate that most men who went on the account lasted no more than 2 years before they were dead, captured, or forced to retire. Some lasted less. The sea took men. Disease took men. Naval vessels hunting pirates took men. The violent and chaotic nature of the life itself took men. If you were a pirate thinking about your future, and most weren't because the whole ethos of the life was living in the present moment, you were probably not thinking in terms of decades. You were thinking in terms of weeks. A buried chest only makes sense if you're coming back for it. And in a world where you might be hanged, drowned, or run through with a sword before next spring, a chest in the ground wasn't a savings account. It was a chest you'd probably never see again. And that assumes you could even find it. Navigation in the 1700s was not the precise science we have today. Islands look alike. Beaches look alike. You could bury something carefully, mark the spot in your memory, and still be unable to locate it again 6 months later when the landscape had shifted, the tide had rearranged the sand, and your mental map had blurred. So, did any pirate, anywhere, ever actually bury treasure? Well, here's where the story gets genuinely interesting. Write your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think there's any chance real buried pirate gold is still out there, somewhere under a beach? Because the truth of what actually happened in the one real case is stranger than anything a novelist could have invented. His name was William Kidd, and his story is almost perfectly designed to be misunderstood. He's been called a pirate, a privateer, a murderer, a patriot, and a scapegoat, depending on who's telling the story and what point they're trying to make. The truth, as is usually the case with history, is more complicated than any single label. But what matters for our purposes today is this. In the summer of 1699, William Kidd dug a hole in the ground, put a significant fortune into it, carefully noted the location, and then told a local landowner exactly where it was. He did this deliberately, openly, and with a specific purpose in mind that had nothing to do with retirement planning. He was trying to save his own life. To understand why, you need a bit of background. Kidd wasn't born a pirate. He was a sea captain, a respected and prosperous one, operating out of New York in the 1680s and 90s. He'd done legitimate work. He'd helped defend English colonial interests in the Caribbean. He had property, a wife, a reputation. In 1695, a group of wealthy English backers, including the Earl of Bellamont, who would later become governor of Massachusetts, financed an expedition and gave Kidd a commission as a privateer. A privateer was essentially a government-licensed sea raider, authorized to attack enemy ships and keep a share of the proceeds. It was a recognized, if morally complicated, profession. Kidd's specific mission was to hunt down pirates in the Indian Ocean and attack French vessels, since England and France were at war at the time. The voyage went wrong in ways that are still debated by historians. Kidd's crew was difficult. Disease cut into his numbers early on, and the promised prizes were slow to materialize. And then, in January of 1698, Kidd made the decision that effectively ended his legitimate career. He captured the Quetta merchant, a large Armenian trading vessel sailing under a French pass. Kidd believed the French pass made her a legal prize. His critics, and there were many of them, especially back in London where the political winds had shifted against him, believed it made him a pirate. By the time Kidd was making his way back toward the Atlantic in 1699, he'd learned that warrants had been issued for his arrest. The men who'd backed his voyage had distanced themselves entirely. He was being called a pirate in the English press. His commission, which should have protected him, was being questioned or outright denied. He needed to negotiate, and to negotiate, he needed leverage. That leverage was his remaining treasure. And so, in late June of 1699, Kidd sailed to Gardiners Island, a small private island off the eastern end of Long Island in what is now New York State. He met with John Gardiner, the owner of the island, and he buried a portion of his plunder there. Gold dust, silver bars, silver coins, precious stones, candlesticks, and other valuables. The total value was assessed at roughly £30,000 sterling at the time, an enormous sum, equivalent to many millions in modern currency. And critically, Kidd didn't try to hide what he was doing. He told Gardiner exactly where the cash was. He gave Gardiner a receipt for some items he left in his personal custody. This wasn't a secret operation. This was a deliberate, witnessed transaction. The buried treasure was not meant to stay buried. It was meant to be there when Kidd needed it, as a bargaining chip. Kidd then sailed north, made contact with intermediaries, and began trying to negotiate his surrender with Governor Bellamont in Boston. He genuinely believed he could talk his way out of the situation. He had his French passes from the ships he'd taken. He had his treasure as evidence of good faith. He offered Bellamont the location of everything he'd buried on Gardiners Island, apparently hoping that the governor's obvious interest in the money would translate into protection. He was wrong. Bellamont had Kidd arrested in Boston in July of 1699. Then he sent men to Gardiners Island with specific instructions to find and recover everything Kidd had buried. John Gardiner cooperated fully. The cash was located, carefully inventoried, and shipped to London. The inventory survives to this day. It lists gold dust, silver bars, silver coins, rubies, diamonds, emeralds, candlesticks, and a range of other precious items. A precise and detailed accounting of every single thing that went into that hole in the ground. All of it became evidence. All of it made the journey to England to be used against the man who'd buried it. William Kidd was tried in London in May of 1701. He was convicted of murder and of piracy on multiple counts. His French passes, which might have supported his defense, disappeared from the record and were only rediscovered in archives in the 20th century. In May of 1701, Kidd was executed at Execution Dock in Wapping. His body was then suspended in a metal cage over the Thames as a warning to other would-be pirates, where it remained for years. The treasure he'd buried on Gardiners Island, the one real buried pirate treasure in recorded history, never came back to him. It sat in a London evidence room and then disappeared into the machinery of the English state. The buried treasure story had exactly one true chapter, and it ended with the man who dug the hole paying the ultimate price for doing so. So how did we get from that grim specific story of a desperate man's failed negotiation to a global mythology about maps and chests and tropical islands? The answer is a children's book, a talented painter, and the remarkable power of a good story to replace the truth. Robert Louis Stevenson was 30 years old in the autumn of 1881 when he drew a map. He was staying at a rented house in the Scottish Highlands with his family. The weather was miserable, and he was, as he frequently was, in poor health. Tuberculosis had been his companion for years. His stepson, a 12-year-old boy named Lloyd Osborne, had a set of watercolors and was amusing himself drawing things. One rainy afternoon, Stevenson sat down and drew a map of a fictional island. He gave it an irregular coastline, added some hills and coves, labeled a few locations, and marked 3 red crosses on it with the annotation, "Bulk of treasure here." He later wrote that the map itself seemed to have a life of its own. Looking at the locations he'd invented, the names he'd made up, the shape of the coastline, stories started to suggest themselves. Who had buried that treasure? How had the map ended up in someone else's hands? What would it take to go and get it? He started writing a story to answer those questions, reading each evening's output aloud to Lloyd and his family. The novel that emerged, first serialized in a children's magazine called Young Folks beginning in 1881, and then published as a complete book in 1883, was Treasure Island. Stevenson drew on a number of real sources in constructing his pirate world. He'd read accounts of the Caribbean pirates and was familiar with the broad outlines of the era, but the central mechanism of the story, the buried treasure map as the engine of adventure, was his own invention. And it was a work of genuine, creative genius. It gave the story a concrete goal, a physical object that could be chased, stolen, fought over, and ultimately found or lost. It gave readers something to hold on to. And because Stevenson was an extraordinary prose stylist, the world he built around that map felt utterly real. The smell of the harbor, the sounds of the inn, the menace of Long John Silver, it all came to life on the page with a vividness that made you forget you were reading fiction. The book was an immediate success, and its influence grew steadily over the following decades. But it was the American illustrator Howard Pyle who gave the buried treasure myth its definitive visual form. Pyle was the most important illustrator of pirate imagery in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His paintings, rich in dramatic light and shadow, showed pirates in the act of burying chests, standing over holes in the ground by torchlight, watching with fierce concentration as their gold went into the earth. Pyle painted the moment that Stevenson had described, and those images lodged themselves in the cultural imagination so deeply that by the early 20th century, most people would have told you, sincerely, that burying treasure was simply what pirates did. It was as natural to them as sailing. Here's what I want to ask you, and I want you to write this in the comments below. If you'd never read Treasure Island or seen any of the films based on it, if no one had ever told you the buried treasure story, would you have assumed pirates hid their gold underground? Or does the whole idea only make sense because Stevenson put it there first? Think about that, because I believe the answer says something important about how all of us understand history. The mythology compounded with each passing decade. Treasure Island was adapted for stage and screen repeatedly throughout the 20th century. Disney released a major film version in 1950 that introduced the story to an entirely new generation. Countless novels, games, and films borrowed its structure and deepened the same assumptions. Each retelling pushed the buried treasure idea further into the cultural bedrock. By the time most of us were old enough to encounter the concept, it had already been reinforced a dozen times from a dozen different directions, and it felt less like the invention of one man and more like an ancient, established fact. And so, people started digging. Literally. The Oak Island mystery, off the coast of Nova Scotia in Canada, has been drawing treasure hunters since the 1790s based on claims, widely regarded by historians as embellished or invented, about a shaft that might contain pirate gold. Excavations have continued on Oak Island for over 2 centuries, have cost enormous sums of money, and have so far produced no treasure whatsoever. The Cocos Island off the coast of Costa Rica has attracted hundreds of expeditions over the years based on stories of buried plunder from Spanish galleons. The island is now a protected national park, partly because the treasure hunters were doing serious damage to the ecosystem in their digging. Beaches across the Caribbean, particularly any with a historical connection to real pirates, have been probed and excavated by hopeful amateurs and professional salvagers alike. None of them have found anything. And based on everything we know about how pirates actually operated, how they lived, how they spent, how briefly most of them survived, none of them ever will. Because the treasure was never there. It was in a novel. It was on a map that a novelist drew for his stepson on a rainy afternoon in Scotland. There's a genuine paradox at the heart of all of this. The one real buried pirate treasure in history, kids' cash on Gardiners Island, carefully inventoried, officially documented, and historically confirmed, was dug up by a colonial governor within weeks of being buried and shipped to London as evidence in a trial. The only time a pirate actually buried his gold, it lasted in the ground for about 2 months before it was gone. The myth, meanwhile, has lasted 140 years and shows no sign of fading. That's the power of a good story. It doesn't matter that the economics were wrong. It doesn't matter that pirates died too fast and spent too freely for any of this to make sense. It doesn't matter that no one has ever found a chest, a map, or an X that turned out to be real. The story feels true, and for most people, that's enough. Robert Louis Stevenson, struggling with illness in the Scottish Highlands, drew a map for a 12-year-old boy, and by doing so, he buried something far more durable than gold. He buried an idea. And ideas, it turns out, are considerably harder to dig up and dispose of than anything a pirate ever put in the ground. Thank you for sailing with us today on Deadman's Shore. If this episode changed how you think about pirate history, or if you're still one of those people who believes there's a chest of doubloons out there with your name on it, tell me about it in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a very good time to do it. We've got a lot more history to uncover, and none of it is going to be what you expect.